Hey, level casters. Today's lesson takes us to a very tense moment in history, a time when the world held its breath. We're going to explore the Cuban Missile Crisis, a 14-day confrontation in October 1962 between the United States and the Soviet Union. This wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a period when the two most powerful countries on Earth were closer to nuclear war than ever before. Imagine waking up every day not knowing if it would be your last, with leaders making decisions that could affect everyone on the planet. That's how many people felt during those 2 weeks. To understand this crisis, we need to go back a little. After World War II, the world was largely divided into two main blocks: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. This period was known as the Cold War, because there was no direct fighting between these two superpowers, but there was a constant struggle for power and influence. Both sides built up huge armies and developed incredibly destructive nuclear weapons. The idea was that if one side attacked, the other would respond with equal force, leading to what was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It was a terrifying concept, but it was also supposed to prevent war. However, in 1959, something big happened very close to the United States. Fidel Castro led a revolution in Cuba, an island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Castro established a communist government, which was a huge concern for the U.S. They saw it as a Soviet ally right on their doorstep. This new relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union set the stage for the crisis we'll discuss today. It was a time of great fear, but also a time when diplomacy and careful decision-making prevented a global catastrophe. Let's dive into the details of how this dramatic event unfolded. The tension began to rise significantly in 1961. The United States, under President John F. Kennedy, tried to overthrow Castro's government in Cuba through an operation known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was a secret plan where Cuban exiles, trained and supported by the U.S., would invade Cuba and spark a popular uprising. However, the invasion was a complete failure. It strengthened Castro's position and pushed Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union. Feeling threatened by the U.S., Castro asked the Soviet Union for protection. The Soviet leader at the time was Nikita Khrushchev. He saw an opportunity. The U.S. had placed nuclear missiles in Turkey, very close to the Soviet Union's borders. Khrushchev thought, if they can put missiles near us, we can put missiles near them. So, in the summer of 1962, the Soviet Union secretly began to install medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. These missiles could reach major U.S. cities, including Washington, D.C., in just minutes. This was a game-changer. The U.S. had always believed it was safe from a direct nuclear attack because of the distance. Now, that safety was gone. The secret operation was very carefully planned. Soviet ships transported the missile components and thousands of soldiers to Cuba, disguised as agricultural equipment and civilian passengers. The Cubans helped to build the missile sites, often working at night to avoid detection. For weeks, the U.S. was unaware of what was happening. However, on October 14, 1962, a U.S. U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and took high-resolution photographs. When these photos were developed and analyzed, they revealed unmistakable evidence: missile launch sites were being constructed. The images showed missile launchers, erectors, and even missiles themselves. This discovery immediately triggered a massive alarm within the U.S. government. President Kennedy was informed, and he quickly assembled a group of his top advisors, known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. They had to act fast, and every option carried immense risks. The discovery of the missiles plunged the world into the most dangerous standoff of the Cold War. President Kennedy and his ExComm advisors debated for days. They considered several options, each with serious consequences. One option was a full-scale invasion of Cuba to remove the missiles by force. However, this carried the huge risk of a direct war with the Soviet Union, which could quickly escalate into a nuclear conflict. Another option was an airstrike to destroy the missile sites. But there was no guarantee they would get all the missiles, and it would likely lead to Soviet retaliation. Kennedy also had to consider the possibility that Soviet troops in Cuba might already have tactical nuclear weapons, which they could use against an invading force. After much intense discussion, Kennedy decided on a more cautious approach, a naval blockade, which he called a quarantine, around Cuba. The idea was to prevent any more Soviet ships carrying military equipment from reaching the island. On October 22, President Kennedy announced the discovery of the missiles to the American public on television. He explained the quarantine and demanded that the Soviet Union remove the missiles already in Cuba. The world reacted with shock and fear. People everywhere wondered if this was the beginning of World War III. Soviet ships carrying more missile components were heading towards Cuba, and U.S. Navy ships were waiting to intercept them. For several days, the world held its breath. Would the Soviet ships challenge the quarantine? Would there be a clash at sea? The tension was almost unbearable. Behind the scenes, secret negotiations were taking place. Messages were exchanged between Kennedy and Khrushchev, often through back channels and intermediaries. Both leaders knew the stakes were incredibly high. They were looking for a way out of this crisis without losing face or starting a global war. The key was finding a compromise that both sides could accept. The pressure was immense, and the smallest miscalculation could have led to disaster. After days of intense negotiations and high-stakes brinkmanship, a resolution finally began to emerge. On October 26, Khrushchev sent a long, emotional letter to Kennedy, offering to remove the missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. The next day, however, a second, tougher letter arrived from Khrushchev, adding a new condition: the U.S. must also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. These U.S. missiles in Turkey were old and obsolete, but their removal was a matter of pride for the Soviets. At the same time, a U.S. U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. This incident ratcheted up the tension even further, pushing the world closer to the edge. Many advisors urged Kennedy to retaliate, but he chose a calmer path. Kennedy and his advisors decided to accept Khrushchev's first offer publicly, the non-invasion pledge, and secretly agreed to the second demand about the missiles in Turkey. This secret agreement was crucial because it allowed Khrushchev to save face and present the deal as a victory to his own people. On October 28, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle its missile sites in Cuba and return the missiles to the Soviet Union, under UN inspection. In return, the U.S. publicly pledged not to invade Cuba. The crisis was over. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a terrifying reminder of how close humanity came to nuclear war. It highlighted the dangers of the Cold War and the importance of diplomacy. Both leaders, Kennedy and Khrushchev, learned valuable lessons about communication and de-escalation. As a direct result, a hotline was established between Washington and Moscow, a direct communication link to prevent future misunderstandings. The crisis also led to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. It was a moment that changed international relations forever, demonstrating that even in the most dangerous situations, dialogue and compromise can prevent catastrophe.
Wow, that was a truly frightening time.
Yes, it was incredibly tense. I can't imagine living through that.
Kennedy and Khrushchev made huge decisions.
Absolutely. The whole world was watching them.
So the U.S. missiles in Turkey were a big part of it.
Yes, they were a key bargaining chip for the Soviets.
It sounds like a very delicate negotiation.
It was. Every move mattered.
What if the spy plane wasn't shot down?
That incident made things much more dangerous.
I'm glad they found a peaceful solution.
Me too. Diplomacy really saved the day.
And the hotline was a good idea after that.
Definitely. Better communication is always important.
It shows how quickly things can escalate.
Yes, especially with nuclear weapons involved.
So this was the closest to nuclear war ever?
That's what many historians believe.
It's a powerful lesson from history.
It certainly is. We should learn from it.
That was a great lesson.
I agree. Keep learning, Levelcasters.
That's all for today. Keep it up, and we'll see you in the next Levelcast lesson.